Shams an inn outside Samarkand, March 1242. Burdened with loneliness, all fast asleep in separate dreams, were more than a dozen weary travelers upstairs at the inn. I stepped over bare feet and hands to reach my empty bedroll that reeked of sweat and mold. I lay there in the dark, mulling over the day's events and reflecting on any divine signs I might have witnessed but, in my haste or ignorance, failed to appreciate. Since I was a boy, I had received visions and heard voices. I always talked to God, and He always responded. Some days I ascended all the way up to the seventh sky as light as a whisper. Then I descended into the deepest pits of the earth, suffused with the smells of soil, hidden away like a rock buried under mighty oaks and sweet chestnuts. Every so often I lost my appetite for food and went without eating for days on end. None of these things scared me, though in time I had learned not to mention them to others. Human beings tended to disparage what they couldn't comprehend. I had learned that firsthand. The first person to misjudge my visions was my father. I must have been 10 years old when I started seeing my guardian angel on a daily basis and was naive enough to think that everyone else did as well. One day, while my father was teaching me how to build a cedar chest so that I could become a carpenter like him, I told him about my guardian angel. "You have a wild imagination, son," my father said dryly. "And you better keep it to yourself. We don't want to upset the villagers again." A few days before, the neighbors had complained about me to my parents, accusing me of acting strange and scaring their kids. "I don't understand your ways, my son. Why can't you accept that you are no more remarkable than your parents?" My father asked. "Every child takes after his father and mother. So have you." That was when I realized that although I loved my parents and craved their love, they were strangers to me. "Father, I am from a different egg than your other children. Think of me as a duckling raised by hens. I am not a domestic bird destined to spend his life in a chicken coop. The water that scares you rejuvenates me. For unlike you I can swim, and swim I shall. The ocean is my homeland. If you are with me, come to the ocean. If not, stop interfering with me and go back to the chicken coop." My father's eyes grew large, then small and distant. "If this is the way you talk to your father now," he said gravely, "I wonder how you will address your enemies when you grow up." Much to the chagrin of my parents, the visions did not disappear as I got older. If anything, they became more intense and gripping. I knew I made my parents nervous, and I felt guilty for upsetting them so, but the truth is, I didn't know how to end the visions, and even if I had, I don't think I would have. Before long I left my house for good. Since then Tabriz has become a smooth, sweet word, so fine and delicate that it melts on my tongue. 3 scents accompany my memories of this place: cut wood, poppy seed bread, and the soft, crisp smell of snow. I have been a wandering dervish ever since, not sleeping in the same place more than once, not eating out of the same bowl twice in a row, every day seeing different faces around me. When hungry, I earn a few coins by interpreting dreams. In this state I roam east and west, searching for God high and low. I hunt everywhere for a life worth living and a knowledge worth knowing. Having roots nowhere, I have everywhere to go. During my travels I have taken all sorts of roads, from popular trade routes to forgotten tracks where you wouldn't run into a soul for days on end. From the coasts of the Black Sea to the cities of Persia, from the vast steppes of Central Asia to the sand dunes of Arabia, I have passed through thick forests, flat grasslands, and deserts. Sojourned at caravansaries and hostels, consulted with the learned men in age-old libraries. Listened to tutors teaching little children in maktabs. Discussed tafsir and logic with students in madrasas. Visited temples, monasteries, and shrines, meditated with hermits in their caves. Performed zikr with dervishes, fasted with sages and dined with heretics. Danced with shamans under the full moon, come to know people of all faiths, ages, and professions. And witnessed misfortunes and miracles alike. I have seen poverty-stricken villages, fields blackened by fire, and plundered towns where the rivers ran red and there were no men left alive above the age of 10. I have seen the worst and the best in humanity. Nothing surprises me anymore. As I went through all these experiences, I began to compile a list that wasn't written down in any book, only inscribed in my soul. This personal list I called the basic principles of the itinerant mystics of Islam. To me these were as universal, dependable, and invariable as the laws of nature. Together they constituted the 40 rules of the religion of love, which could be attained through love and love only. And one of those rules said, "The path to the truth is a labor of the heart, not of the head. Make your heart your primary guide, not your mind. Meet, challenge, and ultimately prevail over your nafs with your heart. Knowing your ego will lead you to the knowledge of God." It had taken me years to finish working on these rules. All 40 of them. And now that I was done, I knew I was nearing the final stage of my time in this world. Lately I had been having many visions in this direction. It wasn't death that worried me, for I didn't see it as an end, but dying without leaving a legacy behind. There were many words piled up inside my chest, stories waiting to be told. I wanted to hand all this knowledge to one other person, neither a master nor a disciple. I sought an equal, a companion. God, I whispered into the dark, damp room, all my life I traveled the world and followed thy path. I saw every person as an open book, a walking Quran. I stayed away from the ivory towers of scholars, preferring to spend time with outcasts, expatriates, and exiles. Now I am bursting. Help me to hand thy wisdom to the right person. Then thou can do with me as thou wish. Before my eyes the room was showered with a light so bright that the faces of the travelers in their beds turned lurid blue. The air inside smelled fresh and alive, as if all the windows had been pushed open and a gusty wind brought in the scent of lilies and jasmine from faraway gardens. "Go to Baghdad," fluted my guardian angel in a sing-song voice. "What is awaiting me in Baghdad?" I asked. "You prayed for a companion, and a companion you will be given. In Baghdad you will find the master who will point you in the right direction." Tears of gratitude welled up in my eyes. Now I knew that the man in my vision was no other than my spiritual companion. Sooner or later we were destined to meet. And when we did, I would learn why his kind hazel eyes were eternally sad and how I came to be murdered on an early spring night. Ella, Northampton, May 19, 2008. Before the sun had set and the children had come back home, Ella placed a bookmark in the manuscript and put sweet blasphemy aside. Curious about the man who had written the novel, she went online and Googled A.Z. Zahara, wondering what would pop up but not expecting much. To her surprise, a personal blog appeared. The colors on the page were predominantly amethyst and turquoise, and on top of the page a male figure with a long white skirt whirled slowly. Having never seen a whirling dervish before, Ella took a careful look at the picture. The blog was titled An Eggshell Named Life, and beneath it there was a poem with the same title, Let us choose one another as companions. Let us sit at each other's feet. Inwardly we have many harmonies, think not that we are only what we see. The page was full of postcards from cities and sites all around the world. Underneath each postcard there were comments about that particular place. It was while reading these that Ella came across 3 pieces of information that immediately drew her attention. First, that the A in A.Z. Zahara stood for Aziz. Second, that Aziz regarded himself as a Sufi. Third, that at the moment he was traveling somewhere in Guatemala. In another section there were samples of the photos he had taken. Most were portraits of people of all colors and stripes. Despite their stark differences, they resembled one another in one curious respect: all the people in all the portraits had something visibly missing. For some the missing element was a simple thing, like an earring, a shoe, or a button, while for others it was much more substantial, like a tooth, a finger, or sometimes a leg. Underneath the photos it read, "No matter who we are or where we live, deep inside we all feel incomplete. It's like we have lost something and need to get it back. Just what that something is, most of us never find out. And of those who do, even fewer manage to go out and look for it." Ella scrolled up and down the web page, clicked on every postcard to enlarge it, and read every comment Aziz had made. At the bottom of the page, there was an email address, azizzahara@gmail.com, which she wrote down on a piece of paper. Next to that she found a poem by Rumi, "Choose love, love. Without the sweet life of love, living is a burden, as you have seen." It was while reading this poem that a most peculiar thought flashed across her mind. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if everything Aziz Z. Zahara included in his personal blog, the pictures, the comments, the quotations, and the poems, were written for her eyes only. It was a strange and slightly supercilious thought, but one that made perfect sense to her. Later in the afternoon, Ella sat by the window, feeling tired and slightly down, the sun heavy on her back and the air in the kitchen filled with the smells of the brownies she was baking. She had Sweet Blasphemy open in front of her, but her mind was so preoccupied she couldn't concentrate on the manuscript. It occurred to her that perhaps she, too, should write her own set of ground rules. She could name it the 40 Rules of the Deeply Settled, Earthy Housewife. Rule number 1, she murmured. Stop looking for love. Stop running after impossible dreams. There are surely more important things in life for a married woman about to be 40. But her own joke produced an obscure discomfort in Ella, reminding her of bigger worries. Unable to hold herself back anymore, she gave her elder daughter a call. She got her answering machine. Jeanette, dear, I know it was wrong of me to call Scott. But my intentions weren't bad. I just wanted to make sure. She paused, deeply regretting not planning this message in advance. She could hear the soft rustle of the answering machine recording in the background. It made her nervous to think that the tape was rolling and time was running short. Jeanette, I'm sorry for the things I do. I know I shouldn't complain when I'm so blessed. But it's just that I'm so unhappy. Click. The answering machine came to a stop. Ella's heart constricted with the shock of what she'd just said. What had come over her? She hadn't known she was unhappy. Was it possible to be depressed and not know it? Oddly enough, she didn't feel unhappy about confessing her unhappiness. She hadn't been feeling much of anything lately. Her gaze slid to the piece of paper on which she'd written Aziz Z. Zahara's email address. The address looked simple, unpretentious, and somehow inviting. Without giving it much thought, she went to her computer and started composing an email. Dear Aziz Z. Zahara, my name is Ella. I am reading your novel Sweet Blasphemy in my capacity as a reader for the literary agency. I have only just begun, and I am enjoying it immensely. This, however, is my personal opinion and is not reflective of the views of my boss. Whether I like your novel or not, I have barely any influence on the final decision as to whether we will take you on as a client. It seems like you believe that love is the essence of life and that nothing else matters. It's not my intention to get into a fruitless debate with you on this matter. Suffice it to say that I do not completely agree. But this is not why I am writing to you. I am writing because the timing of my reading Sweet Blasphemy couldn't have been more bizarre. Currently I am trying to persuade my elder daughter not to marry so young. The day before, I asked her boyfriend to call off their marriage plans. Now my daughter hates me and refuses to talk to me. I have a feeling you two would get along well, as you seem to have very similar views on love. I am sorry to pour my personal problems out to you. That wasn't my intention. Your personal blog, that is where I found your email address, says you are in Guatemala. Traveling around the world must be quite a thrill. If you happen to come to Boston, perhaps we could meet in person and talk over a cup of coffee. Best wishes, Ella. Her first email to Aziz was not a letter so much as an invitation, a cry for help. But Ella had no way of knowing this as she sat in the silence of her kitchen and composed a note to an unknown writer she didn't expect to meet now or at any time in the future. The Master Baghdad, April 1242. Baghdad took no note of the arrival of Shams of Tabriz, but I will never forget the day he came to our modest dervish lodge. We had important guests that afternoon. The High Judge had dropped by with a group of his men, and I suspected there was more than cordiality behind his visit. Renowned for his dislike of Sufism, the judge wanted to remind me that he kept an eye on us, just as he kept an eye on all the Sufis in the area. The judge was an ambitious man. He had a broad face, a sagging belly, and short, stubby fingers, each with a precious ring. He had to stop eating so much, but I suspected that nobody had the courage to tell him, not even his doctor. Coming from a long line of religious scholars, he was one of the most influential men in the area. With one ruling he could send a man to the gallows, or he could just as easily pardon a convict's crimes, lifting him up from the darkest dungeons. Always dressed in fur coats and expensive garments, he carried himself with the grandeur of someone who was sure of his authority. I did not approve of his big ego, but for the well-being of our lodge I did my best to remain on good terms with this man of influence. We live in the most magnificent city in the world, the judge pronounced as he popped a fig into his mouth. Today Baghdad overflows with refugees running away from the Mongol army. We provide them safe haven. This is the center of the world, don't you think, Baba Zaman? This city is a gem, no doubt, I said carefully. But let us not forget that cities are like human beings. They are born, they go through childhood and adolescence, they grow old, and eventually they die. At this moment in time, Baghdad is in its late youth. We are not as wealthy as we used to be at the time of Caliph Harun ar-Rashid, though we can still take a measure of pride in being a center of trade, crafts, and poetry. But who knows what the city will look like 1,000 years from now? Everything might be different. Such pessimism. The judge shook his head as he reached out to another bowl and picked a date. The Abbasid rule will prevail, and we will prosper. That is, of course, if the status quo is not disrupted by the traitors among us. There are those who call themselves Muslim, but their interpretation of Islam is far more dangerous than threats from infidels. I chose to remain silent. It was no secret that the judge thought the mystics, with their individualistic and esoteric interpretations of Islam, were troublemakers. He accused us of paying no heed to the Sharia and thus disrespecting the men of authority, men like him. Sometimes I had the feeling he would rather have all Sufis kicked out of Baghdad. Your brotherhood is harmless, but don't you think some Sufis are beyond the pale? The judge asked, stroking his beard. I didn't know how to respond to that. Thank God just then we heard a knock on the door. It was the ginger-haired novice. He made a beeline toward me and whispered in my ear that we had a visitor, a wandering dervish who insisted upon seeing me and refused to talk to anyone else. Normally I would have asked the novice to take the newcomer to a quiet, welcoming room, give him warm food, and make him wait until the guests had left. But as the judge was giving me a hard time, it occurred to me that a wandering dervish could dispel the tension in the room by telling us colorful stories from faraway lands. So I asked the novice to bring the man in. A few minutes later, the door opened and in walked a man dressed head to toe in black. Lank, gaunt, and of indeterminable age, he had a sharp nose, deeply set pitch-black eyes, and dark hair that fell over his eyes in thick curls. He wore a long, hooded cloak, a wool garment, and sheepskin boots. There were a number of charms around his neck. He held a wooden bowl in his hand of the sort that mendicant dervishes carry to overcome their personal vanity and hubris by accepting the charity of others. I realized that here was a man who did not pay much attention to the judgments of society. That people could confuse him with some vagrant, or even a beggar, didn't seem to bother him in the least. As soon as I saw him standing there, awaiting permission to introduce himself, I sensed he was different. It was in his eyes, in his elaborate gestures, written all over him. Like an acorn that might seem modest and vulnerable to ignorant eyes but already heralds the proud oak tree that it will turn out to be, he looked at me with those piercing black eyes and nodded silently. Welcome to our lodge, Dervish, I said as I motioned for him to take a seat on the cushions across from me. After greeting everyone, the dervish sat down, inspecting the people in the room, taking in every detail. Finally his gaze stopped at the judge. The two men looked at each other for a full minute, without so much as a word, and I couldn't help wondering what each thought of the other, as they seemed so very opposite. I offered the dervish warm goat milk, sweetened figs, and filled dates, all of which he politely refused. When asked his name, he introduced himself as Shams of Tabriz and said he was a wandering dervish searching for God high and low. And were you able to find him? I inquired. A shadow crossed his face as the dervish nodded and said, indeed, he was with me all along. The judge interjected with a smirk he didn't bother to hide, I never understand why you dervishes make life so complicated. If God was with you all along, why did you rummage around this whole time in search of him? Shams of Tabriz bowed his head pensively and remained silent for a moment. When he looked up again, his face was calm, his voice measured. Because although it is a fact that he cannot be found by seeking, only those who seek can find him. Such wordplay, the judge scoffed. Are you trying to tell us that we cannot find God if we stay in the same place all our lives? That's nonsense. Not everyone needs to dress in tatters and hit the road like you. There followed a ripple of laughter as the men in the room were eager to show their agreement with the judge, high-pitched, unconfident, and unhappy laughs from people used to toting to superiors. I felt uneasy. Obviously it hadn't been a good idea to bring the judge and the dervish together. Perhaps I was misunderstood. I didn't mean to say one could not find God if he stayed in his hometown. That is certainly possible, conceded the dervish. There are people who have never traveled anywhere and yet have seen the world. Exactly. The judge grinned triumphantly, a grin that vanished upon hearing what the dervish uttered next. What I meant to say, Judge, was that one could not find God if he stayed in the fur coat, silk garment, and pricey jewelry that you are wearing today. A stunned silence descended upon the room, the sounds and sighs around us dissolving down to dust. We all held our breath, as if expecting something bigger to happen, though what could have been more shocking, I didn't know. Your tongue is too sharp for a dervish, the judge said. When something needs to be said, I'll say it even if the whole world grabs me by the neck and tells me to keep quiet. This was met with a frown from the judge, but then he shrugged dismissively. Well, whatever, he said. In any case, you are the man we need. We were just talking about the splendor of our city. You must have seen many places. Is there a place more charming than Baghdad? Softly, his gaze moving from one man to another, Shams explained, there is no question Baghdad is a remarkable city, but no beauty on earth lasts forever. Cities are erected on spiritual columns. Like giant mirrors, they reflect the hearts of their residents. If those hearts darken and lose faith, cities will lose their glamour. It happens, and it happens all the time. I couldn't help but nod. Shams of Tabriz turned to me, momentarily distracted from his thoughts, with a friendly flicker in his eyes. I felt them on me like the heat of a sweltering sun. That was when I clearly saw how he merited his name. This man was radiating vigor and vitality and burning within, like a ball of fire. He was indeed Shams, the sun. But the judge was of a different mind. You Sufis make everything too complicated. The same with philosophers and poets. Why the need for so many words? Human beings are simple creatures with simple needs. It falls upon the leaders to see to their needs and make sure they do not go astray. That requires applying the Sharia to perfection. The Sharia is like a candle, said Shams of Tabriz. It provides us with much valuable light. But let us not forget that a candle helps us to go from one place to another in the dark. If we forget where we are headed and instead concentrate on the candle, what good is it? The judge grimaced, his face closing up. I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. Entering into a discussion about the significance of the Sharia with a man whose job was to judge, and often punish, people according to the Sharia was swimming in dangerous waters. Didn't Shams know that? Just as I was looking for an appropriate excuse to take the dervish out of the room, I heard him say, there is a rule that applies to this situation. What rule? Asked the judge suspiciously. Shams of Tabriz straightened up, his gaze fixed as if reading from an invisible book, and he pronounced, each and every reader comprehends the Holy Quran on a different level in tandem with the depth of his understanding. There are 4 levels of insight. The first level is the outer meaning, and it is the one that the majority of the people are content with. Next is the Batam, the inner level. Third, there is the inner of the inner. And the 4th level is so deep it cannot be put into words and is therefore bound to remain indescribable. With glinting eyes Shams continued. Scholars who focus on the Sharia know the outer meaning. Sufis know the inner meaning. Saints know the inner of the inner. And as for the 4th level, that is known only by prophets and those closest to God. Are you telling me that an ordinary Sufi has a deeper grasp of the Quran than a Sharia scholar? The judge asked as he tapped his fingers on the bowl. A subtle, sardonic smile curved the dervish's mouth, but he didn't answer. Be careful, my friend, the judge said. There is a thin line between where you stand and sheer blasphemy. If there was a threat in these words, the dervish seemed not to have noticed it. What exactly is sheer blasphemy? He asked, and then with a sharp intake of breath he added, allow me to tell you a story. And here is what he told us. One day Moses was walking in the mountains on his own when he saw a shepherd in the distance. The man was on his knees with his hands spread out to the sky, praying. Moses was delighted, but when he got closer, he was equally stunned to hear the shepherd's prayer. Oh, my beloved God, I love thee more than thou can know. I will do anything for thee, just say the word. Even if thou asked me to slaughter the fattest sheep in my flock in thy name, I would do so without hesitation. Thou would roast it and put its tail fat in thy rice to make it more tasty. Moses inched toward the shepherd, listening attentively. Afterward I would wash thy feet and clean thine ears and pick thy lice for thee. That is how much I love thee." Having heard enough, Moses interrupted the shepherd, yelling, "Stop, you ignorant man. What do you think you are doing? Do you think God eats rice? Do you think God has feet for you to wash? This is not prayer. It is sheer blasphemy." Dazed and ashamed, the shepherd apologized repeatedly and promised to pray as decent people did. Moses taught him several prayers that afternoon. Then he went on his way, utterly pleased with himself. But that night Moses heard a voice. It was God's. "Oh, Moses, what have you done? You scolded that poor shepherd and failed to realize how dear he was to me. He might not be saying the right things in the right way, but he was sincere. His heart was pure and his intentions good. I was pleased with him. His words might have been blasphemy to your ears, but to me they were sweet blasphemy." Moses immediately understood his mistake. The next day, early in the morning, he went back to the mountains to see the shepherd. He found him praying again, except this time he was praying in the way he had been instructed. In his determination to get the prayer right, he was stammering, bereft of the excitement and passion of his earlier prayer. Regretting what he had done to him, Moses patted the shepherd's back and said, "My friend, I was wrong. Please forgive me. Keep praying in your own way. That is more precious in God's eyes." The shepherd was astonished to hear this, but even deeper was his relief. Nevertheless, he did not want to go back to his old prayers. Neither did he abide by the formal prayers that Moses had taught him. He had now found a new way of communicating with God. Though satisfied and blessed in his naive devotion, he was now past that stage, beyond his sweet blasphemy. "So you see, don't judge the way other people connect to God," concluded Shams. "To each his own way and his own prayer. God does not take us at our word. He looks deep into our hearts. It is not the ceremonies or rituals that make a difference, but whether our hearts are sufficiently pure or not." I checked the judge's face. I could see beneath his mask of absolute confidence and composure that he was clearly annoyed. Yet at the same time, being the astute man that he was, he had detected a tricky situation. If he reacted to Shams's story, he would have to take the next step and punish him for his insolence, in which case things would get serious and everybody would hear that a simple dervish had dared to confront the high judge. It was therefore better for him to pretend there was nothing to be upset about and leave it there. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky a dozen shades of crimson, punctuated now and again by dark gray clouds. In a little while, the judge rose to his feet, saying he had some important business to attend to. After giving me a slight nod and Shams of Tabriz a cold stare, he strode off. His men followed wordlessly. "I am afraid the judge didn't like you much," I said when everyone had left. Shams of Tabriz brushed his hair from his face, smiling. "Oh, that is quite all right. I am used to people not liking me much." I couldn't help feeling excited. I had been the master of this lodge long enough to know that it was not often such a visitor came. "Tell me, Dervish," I said, "what brings someone like you to Baghdad?" I was eager to hear his answer but also strangely fearful of it. Ella Northampton, May 20, 2008. Belly dancers and dervishes spun in Ella's dream on the night her husband didn't come home. Her head resting on the manuscript, she watched as rough-looking warriors dined at a roadside inn, their plates piled high with delicious pies and desserts. Then she saw herself. She was searching for someone in a bustling bazaar in a citadel in a foreign country. All around her, people moved slowly, as if dancing to a tune she couldn't hear. She stopped a fat man with a drooping mustache to ask something, only she couldn't remember the question. The man looked at her blankly and hobbled away. She tried to talk to several vendors and then shoppers, but no one responded to her. At first she thought it was because she couldn't speak their language. Then she put her hand to her mouth and realized with horror that her tongue had been cut off. With increasing panic she looked around for a mirror to see her reflection and figure out if she was still the same person, but there was none in the bazaar. She started to cry and woke up to a disturbing sound, not knowing whether she still had a tongue. When Ella opened her eyes, she found Spirit frantically scratching at the back door. An animal had probably gotten onto the porch, driving the dog crazy. Skunks made him particularly nervous. The memory of his inopportune encounter with one last winter was still fresh. It had taken Ella weeks to remove that nasty odor from the dog, and even after she'd washed him in tubs of tomato juice, the smell lingered, reminiscent of burning rubber. Ella glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 2:45 in the morning. David was still not back, and perhaps he never would be. Jeanette had not returned her call, and in her pessimistic state Ella doubted she ever would. Seized by the terror of being abandoned by her husband and daughter, she opened the fridge and looked through it for a few minutes. The desire to scoop out some cherry vanilla ice cream warred with the fear of gaining weight. With no small effort, she took a step away from the fridge and slammed the door, a bit more harshly than necessary. Then Ella opened a bottle of red wine and poured herself a glass. It was good wine, light and lively, with an underlying hint of bittersweetness that she liked. Only when she was filling the second glass did it occur to her she might have opened one of David's expensive Bordeaux. She checked the label, Chateau Margaux 1996. Not knowing what to make of that, she frowned at the bottle. She was too tired and too sleepy to read anymore, so she decided to check her email. There, among half a dozen junk emails and a message from Michelle inquiring about how the manuscript was going, she found an email from Aziz Z. Zahara. Dear Ella, if I may, your email found me in a village in Guatemala called Momostenango. It's one of the few places left where they still use a Mayan calendar. Right across from my hostel, there is a wish tree bedecked with hundreds of pieces of fabric of every color and pattern you can imagine. They call it the tree of the broken-hearted. Those with broken hearts write down their names on pieces of paper and tie these to the branches, praying for their hearts to be healed. I hope you won't find this too presumptuous, but after reading your email I went to the wish tree and prayed that you and your daughter solve this misunderstanding. Even a speck of love should not go unappreciated, because, as Rumi said, love is the water of life. One thing that has helped me personally in the past was to stop interfering with the people around me and getting frustrated when I couldn't change them. Instead of intrusion or passivity, may I suggest submission? Some people make the mistake of confusing submission with weakness, whereas it is anything but. Submission is a form of peaceful acceptance of the terms of the universe, including the things we are currently unable to change or comprehend. According to the Mayan calendar, today is an auspicious day. A major astrological shift is on its way, ushering in a new human consciousness. I need to hurry to send you this email before the sun sets and the day is over. May love find you when you least expect, where you least expect. Yours sincerely, Aziz. Ella shut off the laptop, moved to learn that a complete stranger in a remote corner of the world had prayed for her well-being. She closed her eyes and imagined her name written on a piece of paper tied to a wish tree, dangling like a kite in the air, free and happy. A few minutes later, she opened the kitchen door and stepped out into the backyard, enjoying the unsettling coolness of the breeze. Spirit stood beside her, uneasy and growling, constantly sniffing the air. The dog's eyes grew small, then big and anxious, and his ears kept perking up, as if he had recognized in the distance something scary. Ella and her dog stood side by side under the late spring moon, staring into the thick, vast darkness, similarly frightened of the things moving in the dark, frightened of the unknown. The Novice Baghdad, April 1242. Bowing and scraping, I showed the judge to the door and quickly returned to the main room to collect the dirty bowls. I was surprised to find Baba Zaman and the wandering dervish in the same position as when I left them, neither one saying a word. Out of the corner of my eye, I checked them, wondering if it could be possible to carry on a conversation without talking. I lingered there as long as I could, arranging the cushions, tidying up the room, picking up the crumbs on the carpet, but after a while I ran out of reasons to stay. Half-heartedly, I dragged my feet back to the kitchen. As soon as he saw me, the cook started to rain orders. Wipe the counter, mop the floor, wash the dishes, scrub the stove and the walls around the grill. And when you are done, don't forget to check the mousetraps. Ever since I'd come to this lodge some 6 months ago, the cook had been riding roughshod over me. Every day he made me work like a dog and called this torture part of my spiritual training, as if washing greasy dishes could be spiritual in any way. A man of few words, the cook had one favorite mantra: cleaning is praying, praying is cleaning. If that were true, all the housewives in Baghdad would have become spiritual masters, I once dared to say. He threw a wooden spoon at my head and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Such back talk will get you nowhere, son. If you want to become a dervish, be as mute as that wooden spoon. Rebelliousness is not a good quality in a novice. Speak less, mature quicker." I hated the cook, but, more than that, I feared him. I had never disobeyed his orders. That is, until this evening. As soon as the cook turned his back, I sneaked out of the kitchen and tiptoed to the main room again, dying to learn more about the wandering dervish. Who was he? What was he doing here? He wasn't like the dervishes in the lodge. His eyes looked fierce and unruly, even when he bowed his head in modesty. There was something so unusual and unpredictable about him that it was almost frightening. I peeped through a crack in the door. At first I couldn't see anything. But soon my eyes adjusted to the semidarkness inside the room and I could make out their faces. I heard the master ask, "Tell me, Shams of Tabriz, what brings someone like you to Baghdad? Have you seen this place in a dream?" The dervish shook his head. "No, it wasn't a dream that brought me here. It was a vision. I never have dreams." "Everybody has dreams," Baba Zaman said tenderly. "It's just that you might not remember them all the time. But that doesn't mean you don't dream." "But I do not," the dervish insisted. "It is part of a deal I made with God. You see, when I was a boy, I saw angels and watched the mysteries of the universe unfold before my eyes. When I told this to my parents, they weren't pleased and told me to stop dreaming. When I confided in my friends, they, too, said I was a hopeless dreamer. I tried talking to my teachers, but their response was no different. Finally I understood that whenever people heard something unusual, they called it a dream. I began to dislike the word and all that it represented." Upon saying this, the dervish paused as if he had heard a sudden sound. Then the strangest thing happened. He stood up, straightened his spine, and slowly, deliberately began to walk toward the door, all the while looking in my direction. It was as if he somehow knew I was spying on them. It was as if he could see through the wooden door. My heart pounded like mad. I wanted to run back to the kitchen but couldn't see how. My arms, my legs, my whole body froze. Through and beyond the door, the dark eyes of Shams of Tabriz were fixed upon me. As terrified as I was, I also felt a tremendous amount of energy rushing through my body. He approached, put his hand on the door handle, but just when I thought he was about to open the door and catch me, he stopped. I couldn't see his face from this close and had no idea what had changed his mind. We waited like that for an unbearably long minute. Then he turned his back, and as he paced away from the door, he continued with his story. "When I got a little older, I asked God to take away my ability to dream, so that every time I encountered him, I would know I wasn't dreaming. He agreed. He took them all away. That's why I never dream." Shams of Tabriz now stood by the open windows across the room. Outside, there was a light drizzle, and he watched it pensively before he said, "God took away my ability to dream. But to compensate for that loss, he allowed me to interpret the dreams of others. I am a dream interpreter." I expected Baba Zaman not to believe this nonsense and to scold him, as he scolds me all the time. But instead the master nodded respectfully and said, "You seem to be an unusual person. Tell me, what can I do for you?" "I don't know. Actually, I was hoping you could tell me that." "What do you mean?" asked the master, sounding puzzled. "For almost 40 years, I have been a wandering dervish. I am skilled in the ways of nature, although the ways of society are still alien to me. If necessary, I can fight like a wild animal, but I myself cannot hurt anyone. I can name the constellations in the sky, identify the trees in the forests, and read like an open book the types of people the Almighty has created in His image." Shams paused briefly and waited as the master lit an oil lamp. Then he continued, "One of the rules says, you can study God through everything and everyone in the universe, because God is not confined in a mosque, synagogue, or church. But if you are still in need of knowing where exactly His abode is, there is only one place to look for Him, in the heart of a true lover. There is no one who has lived after seeing Him, just like there is no one who has died after seeing Him. Whoever finds Him will remain with Him forever." In that dim, flickering light, Shams of Tabriz seemed even taller, his hair falling to his shoulders in disorderly waves. But knowledge is like brackish water at the bottom of an old vase unless it flows somewhere. For years I prayed to God for a companion to share the knowledge accumulated inside me. Finally, in a vision in Samarkand, I've been told I should come to Baghdad to fulfill my destiny. I understand that you know the name of my companion and his whereabouts and will tell me, if not now, then later. Outside, the night had settled, and a wedge of moonlight streamed in through the open windows. I realized how late it was. The cook must have been looking for me. But I didn't care. For once it felt good to break the rules. I don't know what kind of answer you are asking of me, murmured the master. But if there is a piece of information I am destined to reveal, I know it will happen in due time. Until then you can stay here with us. Be our guest. Upon hearing this, the wandering dervish bowed humbly and gratefully to kiss Baba Zaman's hand. That is when the master asked that bizarre question. You say you are ready to deliver all your knowledge to another person. You want to hold the truth in your palm as if it were a precious pearl and offer it to someone special. But opening up someone's heart to spiritual light is no small task for a human being. You're stealing God's thunder. What are you willing to pay in return? For as long as I live, I will never forget the answer the dervish gave then. Raising an eyebrow, he said firmly, I am willing to give my head. I flinched, feeling a cold shiver travel down my spine. When I put my eye to the crack again, I noticed that the master looked shaken by the answer as well. Perhaps we have done enough talking for today. Baba Zaman exhaled a sigh. You must be tired. Let me call the young novice. He will show you to your bed and provide clean sheets and a glass of milk. Now Shams of Tabriz turned toward the door, and I felt down to my bones that he was gazing at me again. More than that, it was as if he were looking through and into me, studying the pits and peaks of my soul, inspecting secrets that were hidden even from me. Perhaps he was involved with black magic or had been trained by Harut and Marut, the two angels of Babylon that the Quran warned us against. Or else he possessed supernatural talents that helped him to see through doors and walls. Either way he scared me. No need to call the novice, he said, his voice attaining a higher pitch. I've a feeling he is nearby and has already heard us. I let out a gasp so loud it might have woken the dead in their graves. In utter panic I jumped to my feet and scurried into the garden, seeking refuge in the dark. But an unpleasant surprise was awaiting me there. So there you are, you little rascal, yelled the cook as he ran toward me with a broom in his hand. You are in big trouble, son, big trouble. I jumped aside and managed to duck the broom at the last minute. Come here or I'll break your legs, the cook shouted behind me, puffing. But I didn't. Instead I dashed out of the garden as fast as an arrow. While the face of Shams of Tabriz shimmered before my eyes, I ran along the winding trail that connected the lodge to the main road, and even after I had gotten far away, I couldn't stop running. My heart pounding, my throat dried up, I ran until my knees gave out and I could run no more. Ella Northampton, May 21, 2008. Braced for a quarrel, David came home early the next morning, only to find Ella asleep in bed with Sweet Blasphemy open on her lap and an empty glass of wine by her side. He took a step toward her to pull her blanket up a little and make sure she was snugly covered, but then he changed his mind. 10 minutes later, Ella woke up. She wasn't surprised to hear him in the bathroom taking a shower. Her husband could flirt with other women, and apparently even spend the night with them, but he would rather not take his morning shower anywhere other than his own bathroom. When David finished and walked back through the room, Ella pretended to be asleep, thus saving him from having to explain his absence. Less than an hour later, both her husband and the kids had left, and Ella was in the kitchen alone. Life seemed to have resumed its regular course. She opened her favorite cookbook, Culinary Artistry Made Plain and Easy, and after considering several options chose a fairly demanding menu that would keep her busy all afternoon. Clam chowder with saffron, coconut, and oranges, pasta baked with mushrooms, fresh herbs, and 5 cheeses, rosemary-infused veal spare ribs with vinegar and roasted garlic, lime-bathed green bean and cauliflower salad. Then she decided on a dessert, warm chocolate soufflé. There were many reasons that Ella liked cooking. Creating a delicious meal out of ordinary ingredients was not only gratifying and fulfilling but also strangely sensual. But more than that, she enjoyed cooking because it was something she was really good at. Besides, it quieted her mind. The kitchen was the one place in her life where she could avoid the outside world altogether and stop the flow of time within herself. For some people sex might have the same effect, she imagined, but that always required two, whereas to cook all one needed was time, care, and a bag of groceries. People who cooked on TV programs made it sound as if cooking was about inspiration, originality, and creativity. Their favorite word was experimenting. Ella disagreed. Why not leave experimenting to scientists and quirkiness to artists? Cooking was about learning the basics, following the instructions, and being respectful of the wisdom of ages. All you had to do was use time-honored traditions, not experiment with them. Cooking skills came from customs and conventions, and although it was clear that the modern age belittled such things, there was nothing wrong with being traditional in the kitchen. Ella also cherished her daily routines. Every morning, at roughly the same time, the family had breakfast. Every weekend they went to the same mall, and on the first Sunday of every month they had a dinner party with their neighbors. Because David was a workaholic with little time on his hands, Ella was in charge of everything at home. Managing the finances, caring for the house, reupholstering the furniture, running errands, arranging the kids' schedules and helping them with their homework, and so on. On Thursdays she went to the Fusion Cooking Club, where the members merged the cuisines of different countries and freshened up age-old recipes with new spices and ingredients. Every Friday she spent hours at the farmers' market, chatting with the farmers about their products, inspecting a jar of low-sugar organic peach jam, or explaining to another shopper how best to cook baby portobello mushrooms. Whatever she hadn't been able to find, she picked up from the Whole Foods market on the way home. Then, on Saturday evenings, David took Ella out to a restaurant, usually Thai or Japanese, and if they weren't too tired or drunk or simply not in the mood when they came home, they would have sex. Brief kisses and tender moves that exuded less passion than compassion. Once their most reliable connection, sex had lost its allure quite a while ago. Sometimes they went for weeks without making love. Ella found it odd that sex had once been so important in her life, and now when it was gone, she felt relieved, almost liberated. By and large she was fine with the idea of a long-married couple gradually abandoning the plane of physical attraction for a more reliable and stable way of relating. The only problem was that David hadn't abandoned sex as much as he had abandoned sex with his wife. She had never confronted him openly about his affairs, not even hinting of her suspicions. The fact that none of their close friends knew anything made it easier for her to feign ignorance. There were no scandals, no embarrassing coincidences, nothing to set tongues wagging. She didn't know how he managed it, given the frequency of his couplings with other women, particularly with his young assistants, but her husband handled things deftly and quietly. However, infidelity had a smell. That much Ella knew. If there was a chain of events, Ella couldn't tell which came first and which followed later. Had her loss of interest in sex been the cause of her husband's cheating? Or was it the other way round? Had David cheated on her first, and then she'd neglected her body and lost her sexual desire? Either way the outcome remained the same. The glow between them, the light that had helped them to navigate the uncharted waters of marriage, keeping their desire afloat, even after 3 kids and 20 years, was simply not there anymore. For the next 3 hours, her mind was filled with thoughts while her hands were restless. She chopped tomatoes, minced garlic, sautéed onions, simmered sauce, grated orange peels, and kneaded dough for a loaf of whole wheat bread. That last was based on the golden advice David's mother had given her when they got engaged. "Nothing reminds a man of home like the smell of freshly baked bread," she had said. "Never buy your bread. Bake it yourself, honey. It will work wonders." Working the entire afternoon, Ella set an exquisite table with matching napkins, scented candles, and a bouquet of yellow and orange flowers so bright and striking they looked almost artificial. For the final touch, she added sparkly napkin rings. When she was done, the dining table resembled those found in stylish home magazines. Tired but satisfied, she turned on the kitchen TV to the local news. A young therapist had been stabbed in her apartment, an electrical short had caused a fire in a hospital, and 4 high school students had been arrested for vandalism. She watched the news, shaking her head at the endless dangers looming in the world. How could people like Aziz Zahara find the desire and courage to travel the less developed parts of the globe when even the suburbs in America weren't safe anymore? Ella found it puzzling that an unpredictable and impenetrable world could drive people like her back into their houses, but had almost the opposite effect on someone like Aziz, inspiring him to embark on adventures far off the beaten track. The Rubinsteins sat at a picture-perfect table at 7:30 p.m., the burning candles giving the dining room a sacred air. An outsider watching them might assume they were a perfect family, as graceful as the wisps of smoke slowly dissolving in the air. Even Jeanette's absence didn't tarnish the picture. They ate while Orly and Avi prattled on about the day's events at school. For once Ella felt grateful to them for being so chatty and noisy and covering up the silence that would otherwise have rested heavily between her and her husband. Out of the corner of her eye, Ella watched David jab his fork into a cauliflower and chew slowly. Her gaze dropped to his thin, pale lips and pearl-white teeth, the mouth she knew so well and had kissed so many times. She visualized him kissing another woman. For some reason the rival who appeared in her mind's eye was not David's young secretary but a big-bosomed version of Susan Sarandon. Athletic and confident, she showed off her breasts in a tight dress and wore high-heeled, knee-high red leather boots, her face shiny, almost iridescent with too much makeup. Ella imagined David kissing this woman with haste and hunger, not at all the way he chewed his cauliflower at the family table. It was then and there, while having her culinary artistry made plain and easy dinner and imagining the woman her husband was having an affair with, that something inside Ella snapped. She understood with chilling clarity and calm that despite her inexperience and timidity, one day she would abandon it all. Her kitchen, her dog, her children, her neighbors, her husband, her cookbooks and homemade bread recipes. She would simply walk out into the world where dangerous things happened all the time. The Master Baghdad, January 26, 1243. Being part of a dervish lodge requires far more patience than Shams of Tabriz possesses. Yet 9 months have passed, and he is still with us. In the beginning I expected him to pack up and leave at any moment, so visible was his aversion to a strictly ordered life. I could see that it bored him stiff to have to sleep and wake up at the same hours, eat regular meals, and conform to the same routine as everyone else. He was used to flying as a lonely bird, wild and free. I suspect several times he came close to running away. Nevertheless, great as his need for solitude, even greater was his commitment to finding his companion. Shams firmly believed that one of these days I would come up with the information he needed and tell him where to go, whom to find. With this faith he stayed. During these 9 months, I watched him closely, wondering if time flowed differently for him, more rapidly and intensely. What took other dervishes months, sometimes years, to learn took him only weeks, if not days. He had a remarkable curiosity about everything new and unusual and was a great observer of nature. So many days I found him in the garden admiring the symmetry of a spiderweb or the dewdrops glistening on a night-blooming flower. Insects, plants, and animals seemed more interesting and inspiring to him than books and manuscripts. But just when I would start thinking he had no interest in reading, I would find him immersed in an age-old book. Then, once again, he could go for weeks on end without reading and studying anything. When I asked him about this, he said one should keep the intellect satisfied and yet be careful not to spoil it. It was one of his rules. Intellect and love are made of different materials, he said. Intellect ties people in knots and risks nothing, but love dissolves all tangles and risks everything. Intellect is always cautious and advises, beware too much ecstasy, whereas love says, oh, never mind. Take the plunge. Intellect does not easily break down, whereas love can effortlessly reduce itself to rubble. But treasures are hidden among ruins. A broken heart hides treasures. As I got to know him better, I admired his audacity and acumen. But I also suspected there was a downside to Shams's unrivaled ingenuity and originality. For one thing, he was straightforward to the point of brusqueness. I taught my dervishes never to see the faults of other people and, if they did, to be forgiving and quiet. Shams, however, let no mistake go unnoticed. Whenever he saw anything wrong, he spoke out about it right away, never beating around the bush. His honesty offended others, but he liked to provoke people to see what came out of them in moments of anger. Forcing him to do ordinary tasks was difficult. He had little patience for such jobs and lost interest in something as soon as he got the hang of it. When it came to a routine, he got desperate, like a tiger trapped in a cage. If a conversation bored him or somebody made a foolish remark, he got up and left, never losing time with pleasantries. Values cherished by most human beings, such as security, comfort, and happiness, had hardly any meaning in his eyes. And his distrust of words was so intense that often he went without speaking for days. That, too, was one of his rules. Most of the problems of the world stem from linguistic mistakes and simple misunderstandings. Don't ever take words at face value. When you step into the zone of love, language as we know it becomes obsolete. That which cannot be put into words can only be grasped through silence. In time I became concerned about his well-being, for deep inside I sensed that one who could burn so fervently might have a tendency to put himself into dangerous situations. At the end of the day, our fates are in the hands of God, and only He can tell when or how we each will depart the world. For my part, one decided to do my best to slow Shams down and accustom him, as much as I could, to a more tranquil way of life. And for a while I thought I might succeed. But then came winter, and with the winter came the messenger carrying a letter from afar. That letter changed everything. The letter from Kayseri to Baghdad, February 1243. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My dear brother Baba Zaman, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you. It has been a long time since we have last seen one another, and I hope my letter finds you in good spirits. I have heard so many wonderful things about the lodge you built on the outskirts of Baghdad, teaching dervishes the wisdom and love of God. I am writing this letter in confidentiality to share with you something that has been preoccupying my mind. Allow me to start from the beginning. As you know, the late Sultan Aladdin Kikubid was a remarkable man who excelled in leadership in difficult times. It had been his dream to build a city where poets, artisans, and philosophers could live and work in peace. A dream many called impossible given the chaos and hostility in the world, especially with the Crusaders and Mongols attacking from both sides. We have seen it all. Christians killing Muslims, Christians killing Christians, Muslims killing Christians, Muslims killing Muslims. Warring religions, sects, tribes, even brothers. But Kikubid was a determined leader. He chose the city of Konya, the first place to emerge after the Great Flood, to realize his big dream. Now, in Konya there lives a scholar you may or may not have heard of. His name is Maulana Jalal-Ud-Din, but he often goes by the name Rumi. I have had the pleasure of meeting him, and not only that, of studying with him, first as his teacher, then, upon his father's death, as his mentor, and, after years, as his student. Yes, my friend, I became a student of my student. So talented and judicious was he, after a point I had nothing else to teach him and started to learn from him instead. His father was a brilliant scholar, too. But Rumi has a quality that very few scholars ever have: the ability to dig deep below the husk of religion and pull out from its core the gem that is universal and eternal. I want you to know that these are not solely my personal thoughts. When Rumi met the great mystic, druggist, and perfumist Feriduddin Attar as a young man, Attar said of him, "This boy will open a gate in the heart of love and throw a flame into the hearts of all mystic lovers." Likewise, when Ibn Arabi, the distinguished philosopher, writer, and mystic, saw the young Rumi walking behind his father one day, he exclaimed, "Glory be to God, an ocean is walking behind a lake." As young as the age of 24, Rumi became a spiritual leader. Today, 13 years later, the residents of Konya look up to him as a role model, and every Friday people from all over the region flock to the city to listen to his sermons. He has excelled at law, philosophy, theology, astronomy, history, chemistry, and algebra. Already he is said to have 10,000 disciples. His followers hang upon his every word and see him as a great enlightener who will generate a significant positive change in the history of Islam, if not in the history of the world. But to me Rumi has always been like a son. I promised his late father that I would always keep an eye on him. And now that I am an old man who is nearing his final days, I want to make sure he is in the right company. You see, as remarkable and successful as he no doubt is, Rumi himself has several times confided in me that he feels inwardly dissatisfied. There is something missing in his life, an emptiness that neither his family nor his disciples can fill. Once I told him, though he was anything but raw, he wasn't burned either. His cup was full to the brim, and yet he needed to have the door to his soul opened so that the waters of love could flow in and out. When he asked me how this could be done, I told him he needed a companion, a friend of the path, and reminded him that the Quran says, "Believers are each other's mirrors." Had the subject not come up again, I might have forgotten about it completely, but on the day I left Konya, Rumi came to me to ask my opinion on a recurrent dream that had been bothering him. He told me that in his dream he was searching for someone in a big, bustling city in a land far away.